Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Wilson Center. My name is Will Pomeranz. I'm Deputy Director of the Kennan Institute, and we are pleased to welcome so many of you here today to what will be just an outstanding event on China and Russia in Latin America in 2017 and beyond. I'm going to use this platform to announce one upcoming Kennan Institute event on January 25th from 10 to 11:30. We will have a meeting on NATO and Russia, the quest for mutual deterrence, and it will feature our own Michael Kaufman, who is a global fellow here at the Kennan Institute, as well as a research specialist at CNA Corporation, and Christine Van Bruskgaard. I want to, the fact that we have such a large crowd today is testimony to the fact that this is a joint event, and I want to thank our fellow programs at the Wilson Center, the Latin America program, and the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States, who have co-sponsored today's event and helped get the word out. And we were so pleased to work with all of them to put the event together. If you want to join the conversation today, the Twitter handles are written on the flyers on the wall. So we look forward to having you participate in that manner as well. We will also soon be publishing a Kennan cable by Vladimir Ravinsky, who is one of our speakers today, on understanding Russian priorities in Latin America. And that will be available on our website, and we will distribute it to the audience today as well. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to our moderator, Gonzalo Sebastian Paz, who will introduce the panel and the event. Professor Paz is a visiting researcher at Georgetown University, and he is one of the contributors to the Latin America program's edited volume on reaching across the Pacific, Latin America, and Asia in the new century. He has been a visiting professor at numerous international universities, including in Sweden, Italy, and Israel, and he has also lectured all around the world, including in Moscow and Beijing. So without further ado, I turn the floor over to Professor Paz.
Thank you so much, Director Pomeranz, for your kind presentation and for the help in putting this event together. And also, of course, thank you to the directors of the other two parts of this wonderful institution that it was were mentioned before, the Kissinger Institute and the Latin American program. I think it's a sign of how things works in the 21st century, that the old area studies divisions sometimes it's not fit to understand the reality where we're living in. And so that we need to have this collaboration in order to try to do our job. We're going to have more people coming, and I hope that this will be do smoothly. I hope that we can continue with our conference. At the end of the conference, I hope we're going to have a robust Q&A session. And so our staff will be collecting some questions if you want to present for this part of the conference. Okay, I will introduce our members in our panel. It's a very distinguished panel. With us on my right left is Vladimir Rubinsky, who is from Russia, but almost Colombian now. And he's a George F. Kennan Fellow at the Kennan Institute here at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. And it's Associate Professor at ICESI in Colombia. He have done studies in Russia and in Japan, and have a lot of experience dealing with Russia in Latin America. We have been collaborating for a number of years, and we have a project for a book coming soon, hopefully. And we also put a number of events in different international conferences, such as of the Latin American Studies Association on this subject. And he also follows China engagement in Latin America. We have also with us Hannah Thorburn, who is a research fellow at the Hudson Institute, and she focused on Russia, Ukraine, and Eastern European politics. and the transatlantic relationship. She currently writes the Eurasia Uncovered blog at the World Affairs Journal and is a Penn Campbell Fellow at the National Endowment of Democracy. Thank you very much for joining us. And my other friend, Benjamin Craswell, who is currently a residential postdoctoral fellow in Sino-Latin American U.S. Affairs with the Foreign Policy Institute at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He's German Colombian. I would say Colombia is dominating this panel to some extent today. Benjamin is a sinologist and a historian. He received his PhD in political science in 2015 in Colombia, but he is working now in Washington. Many years ago, in 1978, a French writer wrote that, and I will quote freely, the Chinese are good Wei-Ti or Go players because they are great strategists. And the Russians are great chess players because they are great tacticians. And maybe I would like to explore this idea. Maybe it can be helpful or not to understand what is going on between China and Latin America, styles of engagements, projects in the region. The relevance for this of this conference is quite obvious, as Director Pomeranz mentioned. All of you have navigated this city today, and you managed to be here for good reasons. But I would like to quote a report that George Kennan, the Young, presented to Secretary of State Dan Aitchison on March 29, 1950, after traveling in Latin America. And he said, if the countries of Latin America should come to be generally dominated by an outlook which views our country as the root of all evil and sees salvation only in the destruction of our national power, I doubt very much whether our general political program in the other parts of the non-communist world could be successful. And in another part of this wonderful report, he wrote, and I quote, "The military significance to us of the Latin American countries lie today rather in the extent to which we may be dependent upon them for materials essential to the prosecution of a war, and more importantly, in the extent to which the attitudes of the Latin American peoples may influence the general political trend in the international community." So the value of Latin American countries in the view of George Kennan, the Young, was a political value. This was really very important. And I think that this is at the core of this conversation that we're having today with the important ties and growing ties between China, Latin America, and Russia, Latin America. I would like to mention just a little piece of biographical information who is relevant to understand the structure also of this conference. Several years ago, I was invited to write a chapter on China-Venezuela ties. And I decided to start this chapter on China-Venezuela relations, explaining Russia-Venezuela blossoming relationship, who was a concern for the editor of the book, right? But in 2008, the Peter the Great, a nuclear power ship, the flagship of Russian Northern Fleet, anchored in La Guaira, Venezuela, with the Admiral Shabanenko, another very important warship from Russia, and escorted with other two very powerful warships. And later, one of them crossed the Panama Canal for first time since the Second World War. And several weeks before, in September of 2008, two major Russian long-range strategic bombers, TU 160 NATO code Blackjack, the Alexander Molotchi and the Vasily Senko, they landed in Aragua in Venezuela. And this was covered by the press, the world press, and it was really very impressive, unprecedented in a number of decades. And of course, emboldened by this international support, the following week, President Chavez expelled the American ambassador in Caracas, and he recalled Ambassador Bernardo Alvarez recently died to Caracas. So why I started this chapter on China-Venezuela ties, speaking about Russian-Venezuela ties, because I wanted to create, a comparison between two different styles of relationship. This was, of course, several years ago. I would like to hear comments of the other members of the panel to see if these two different styles that were kind of obvious in this moment have continued or have changed a little bit. I would like to stop here. Let me open the floors, presenting our first question that Benjamin will start addressing. And these questions are really very general. The idea is not to make long presentations, but just to open the exchange between us. And as I have said later, I hope we're going to have a robust Q&A session. What are the short-term, medium-term, and long-term key objectives of Russia and China in Latin America, and what are the strategies they may use to achieve these objectives, and what are the risks of this strategy? Benjamin?
Thank you very much, and it's great to be here among friends, and wonderful to see so many of you interested in this subject. I'm going to speak to China, obviously, to pass on next to Russia. I would basically describe them generally, the relationship, the current way China and Latin America find themselves together is in four words, essentially, which is very firmly established, which we can now say after 15, 20 years of very strong investment, strong trade, loans, getting to know each other quite well. They're now pretty firmly established. They are in it for the long term, so that's something I feel is important to emphasize, because it's clear that Chinese state-owned companies, but also private companies, have been have invested so much, have trained so well many of their staff, and rotate around the region, not only diplomats, but also corporate staff, that there is a perspective of being in there for at least 20, 30 years and well beyond. There are commitments, and with recent drop in values of certain goods, it's even necessary to stay in there for longer still than perhaps originally calculated to make good. Fourthly, I would call them messy, by which I mean quite uneven, and that's something that has been the most disconcerting. And there I'll speak just a moment on strategies. The Chinese, obviously their reason for going out to Latin America, which was perhaps is physically the furthest away part of the world, and has been in that sense the last, quite logically the last for them to explore thoroughly. It is one they have approached initially not knowing it very well, and very unevenly. So we have very good relations that China has established with certain countries, and we know many of them, like Venezuela, Ecuador, Argentina, but others that have not really begun a serious dialogue. So there is great unevenness, and also it's been very heavy on economic factors, and not so much on cultural, scientific collaboration and so on. And that's something that China has recently, in its last policy paper, the second policy paper on Latin America, published end of November, is addressing. So that's my fourth sort of characterization of the relationship, which is it's constantly adjusting. There was quite a lot in the press when Xi Jinping visited three countries, attended the APEC conference, APEC summit there in Peru, and then visited also Chile and Ecuador, there was a lot of importance given to the fact that they're filling a hole that the United States has left. But I would simply, I feel that it's very much part of the long-term strategy and part of an effort to create a greater even playing field for their interaction with the region. So that's as a broad characterization. Maybe in strategies one could add something I've observed and actually wrote in a chapter for a book recently published with the Inter-American Dialogue, is that the government has the strongest platform to present the Chinese government has its strongest platform and has a certain coherent-looking strategy. And there are some suspicions. What does it really want? Should we read between the lines a lot in the policy paper that they published and in other documents? But there are the two more parallel strategies that I find are very important. One is the bilateral sort of coaxing, that is the FTAs with individual countries, what diplomats and businesses do on a sort of day-to-day level. And then there's the, again, messy sort of scatter effect of the 走出去, the go out and encouragement and even strong support for companies to explore and to invest and to become active more and more outside of China. And that is something that even the Chinese government has a difficult time controlling. So I think it's quite a complex picture, and it's important to look at it like that. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. Hannah?
Yeah, so first, my thanks to the Wilson Center for having us today and to Vladimir for putting this panel together. I'm going to cover the Russia section and then hopefully Vladimir will tie it all together. But on this question that you asked, Gonzalo, I think Russia has several objectives when it comes to their influence and their activities in Latin America. First, and I think significantly for some sectors of the Russian economy, they're interested in trade. They're interested in areas where Russian state-owned companies in particular can find new markets and build new clientele. One of the very important areas here is in arms sales. The Russian arms dealers, the Russian arms companies have lost a lot of clients in recent years, including Libya and some of their Middle Eastern arms purchasers, and you see them reaching out to areas that are not traditionally considered areas of Russian influence, like Latin America or Southeast Asia, looking for these new partners in arms purchases. When sanctions were announced against Russia by the EU and by the United States, Latin America was an important source of new foodstuffs, Argentine beef, fruits, vegetables. Latin America was a very important source of these materials. The Chinese are, of course, much better at building what we would traditionally consider business relationships, and they seem to be much more attractive as a partner to Latin America, but Russia does continue to attempt to build these connections, particularly in the area of scientific exploration. You see Rosatom, the Russian state nuclear firm, company, however you'd like to term it, striking deals with several Latin American nations on what they'll call peaceful use of nuclear materials. So nuclear-based research for scientific and medicinal purposes. And in certain cases, they've struck deals in the past to build new nuclear facilities in Latin America. But there's a sort of longer game that I think the Russians are playing with Latin America. And they're also looking to build a kind of influence that can be potentially useful for Russian foreign policy aims in the future. It doesn't necessarily have to be something that pays off now, even 10, 20 years in the future, but you can see that even in the way that their relationship, their strong relations with Venezuela and Nicaragua were built over many years, they were in a way able to call in that favor when they wanted several nations to recognize Abkhazia and South Ossetia, the regions of Georgia that had declared their independence under Russian influence. And by getting Venezuela and Nicaragua to internationally recognize these areas, it was a way for Russia confirming that their influence in Latin America does work, it does matter. And they hoped, though it didn't turn out that way, that it would be the beginning of other nations following in Venezuela and Nicaragua's footsteps. I do also look at Latin America as a kind of place where the Russians have a kind of testing ground in which they can try various tactics and schemes that they may use later on in perhaps larger interactions with their their Chinese as well as American friends. Both there's China, there's Russia, and there's the United States, who are all very active players in Latin America. And Russia tends to look at Latin America as a kind of proving ground for some ideas that they may later put into action, seeing how does this particular idea work in balancing against the Chinese in Latin America? Can we use that in balancing against the Chinese in Africa? Can we do it in South Asia? Can we do it in other parts of the world? So in that sense, Latin America is very important to Russia. I mean, I think if we want to talk about overall foreign policy objectives, where does Latin America fit into that for Russia? You know, Putin is very interested in making Russia a kind of central point of conversation again in foreign affairs. He wants, you know, in no better terms, to make Russia great again and move it back to that position of respect that it once had in the geopolitical realm. And that means building and continuing influence in Latin America and Africa, in other parts of the world that aren't necessarily traditionally considered, like, say, Eastern Europe, to be areas where Russia is very influential. And Latin America, I think, lastly, is reasonably fertile ground for one of the Kremlin's current campaigns, which is to kind of build a new, I call it the new conservative international. This idea that Vladimir Putin's Russia is the vanguard or is the stronghold of traditional values, and that in a world where everything is falling apart, where values no longer matter, it's Russia that is the defender of that. And you see this kind of outreach to Latin America, and whether it's the Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church making a long visit to Latin America last year, going and trying to talk with the ethnic Russian communities that have been in Latin America since the Russian Revolution over 100 years ago. There is a kind of concerted effort to put Russia forward as a new leader. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Hannah. Vladimir?
Thank you very much, and I would like to thank again the Woodrow Wilson Center, my home for several months here, to giving us an opportunity to actually to try to look at what China and Russia are doing in Latin America for some time now. And I think it's one of the first times, at least I'm not aware of any other occasion, when there was an attempt to compare Russia and China in Latin America. I largely agree with my colleagues in their assessment of what has been happening in relations between China and Russia and Latin America, but I would like to emphasize some of the aspects of the evolution of those relations that both of you mentioned. Firstly, I think it is important to remember that even though we started to talk about Russia and China as new players, new actors, extra-hemispheric actors in the Western Hemisphere, more or less about the same time, in the end of the 1990s, the beginning of 2000, I think both of those actors are not exactly new to the region. Of course, we are talking about the legacy of the Soviet Union, which is very important for Russia. And with Vladimir Putin taking power in the beginning of 2000s, I think the understanding of the value of this legacy became crucial for the way how Russia started to redesign and perhaps its strategy towards Latin America. In the case of China, even though interactions did take place during the Cold War, but of course the scale of those interactions was considerably lower than in the case of Russia. But why it is important? In the case of Russia, it is because I think the key value, and it will remain for a long time, the key value of Latin America for Russia, it's its geographical proximity to the United States. So in other words, Latin America for Russia is the US near abroad. And if you look actually how this perspective was forming in the minds of many people in Russia, it's not only with Vladimir Putin. It's actually a continuation of the point of view which emerged right in the beginning of the 20th century and was continuing, and it's still continuing these days. And the value of the geographical proximity of Latin America to the United States, it not only, and I would argue, not primarily because of any military considerations. Something that Gonzalo mentioned, of course, ring the bells here in Washington that Russians are coming, the Russian arms for the first time after the Cold War are here, and they're building strong ties with some of the leftist governments. But I think the primary value of this geographical proximity of Latin America is, again, making Russia great. But this is a kind of a political spectacle that is developing inside Russia. So the primary value of this is for Vladimir Putin being able to demonstrate that Russia is again capable to address issue on the global scale. And this is something that is very valid for Russia, but perhaps not for China, because Latin America, Russians today are well aware about Latin America. If you look at the polls, say in 2006, 2007, not a single Latin American country appeared in the Russian polls. Russians simply forgot about Latin America. But in 2008, 2009, with the recognition given to South Abkhazia, South Ossetia and Abkhazia by Nicaragua, then restoring the ties with Cuba, then the visit of the Patriarch to Cuba, of course, it actually made its ways, and it was one of the purposes, I would argue, for the Russians to re-engage with Latin America. It made its way to the Russian TV, and today, at least several Latin American countries, firstly Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Brazil, they made it to the list of the 10 friendliest countries for Russia according to the Russian public opinion. So I think this is something Russia is really interested in. The second point, I think it's common for China and Russia. What is the value of Russia and China for Latin American politics? Because we are talking about the interest of Russia and Latin America, but I think we also have to understand more clearly what are the reasons why why Russia and China were able to do what they're doing in there. And I think at a certain point it turned out to be very convenient for many politicians in Latin America to show the ways how they can build their influence to demonstrate the incidence of Latin American countries outside the Western Hemisphere. So these frequent visits by many leaders of Venezuela, Nicaragua, Argentina, Ecuador, to name just a few, to Russia, they were highly used by those leaders to demonstrate actual possibility of being engaged in international relations which comes outside of the US sphere of influence. So in the case of China, and I'm finishing here, I think it's not the point because the awareness of Chinese general public about Latin America is quite low. There are a lack of knowledge about Latin America. So I think the priority for China for now is different, is to maintain stable relations as Russia does with almost all Latin American countries, but to focus on trade and investments.
Thank you very much for these wonderful initial reactions. I just would like to add that maybe this factor of the geographical proximity of Latin America to the United States is related with my initial comment about the perception of the Chinese strategists and the Russian tacticians, because they know this factor very well of the proximity of Latin America to the United States, but they seem to use this factor, to manage this factor in different ways. Although in the case of China, if we take a view of the last 15 years, China have shown remarkable restraint, but in recent years, step by step, they are upgrading the game, but still in a very cautious way. And Russians have been more prone for these spectacular actions that create really a lot of impact. Okay, I would like to move to the second trigger, the second question, and this is about perceptions. And this issue of perception had two parts. First, how does Latin America perceive Russia and China? Vladimir already mentioned the Cold War legacies. That is an important difference between the two cases. But also, what is China for Russia in Latin America, and what is Russia for China? How they see these two extra-regional power, how they perceive the other, increasing the relationships with the region. They perceive the other as a competitor, or that still they focus on the action, or they have to care about the United States, or they have a particular perception about how the other is interacting in the region. We can follow the same order. Benjamin, if you want to start.
Sure. Thank you. Well, I for this thinking about this, I didn't only think all on my own, but I quizzed a number of colleagues in China and Argentina, Mexico, Peru, and Colombia, just to sort of get a broader feel. And the overall reaction was, certainly in terms of what Russia and China perceive of each other, was no, that's not, well, interestingly, my Argentinian colleague, and I don't know whether you would agree with that, but the Argentinian I spoke to did think that there were still feelings of perceived competition between the Chinese and the Russians in that particular country. But overall, there was a feeling that they're independent. What I would underscore in terms of perceptions, what's really quite troubling for me, often having lived in Colombia for a long time, is in terms of what Latin Americans broadly perceived so how they see China is relatively with great concern and quite negative image, and that sometimes boils down to plain old racism and of this sort of the newness to some extent of Chinese presence in some countries. But then I should qualify that, because in fact it varies from country to country, and it's interesting that the countries with where the general population, according to Latino Barometro and other polls, where the perception towards Chinese is the most negative, is also where they have either relations with Taiwan, in other words, they don't even have a relationship with People's Republic, or one case being Colombia, where basically there is very little Chinese engagement. So it's really great. The few Chinese that are present are viewed with some suspicion, and there's quite a deal of ignorance in terms of what really other interests of the Chinese in the middle and long term, the commitment and so on. Whereas the countries that have strong Chinese presence, like Venezuela, Ecuador, and there are many people in the broad population who believe that China will help solve some of the country's problems. There is always that sort of underlying, well, it's one of the questions put to people. And so that's interesting that in fact where there is stronger Chinese presence, measurable, there is also generally a more positive opinion. So that's something that I think really characterizes those, again, still very different approaches that China has from country to country. But it's something that I think China is working on and building on, and the poster child Peru is where China is trying very much to overcome certain difficulties that they've clearly had in their longest investments there and protests and so on, but they have also got a very strong rapport. And so that's something they continue to build on, and hopefully will want to, or are trying to replicate in other countries through certain strategies. But I still don't think that Russia and China are perceived as sort of competitors. They're two quite different types of aliens in Latin America.
Thank you so much, Benjamin. Hannah?
So there's a couple of interesting things to cover here, and I think I'll start with where Vladimir left off in talking about the Cold War legacy in Latin America and the way that Latin America perceives Russia, because I do think that those things are increasingly less intertwined, but they still matter. And Russia has spent a lot of time and money focusing its energies on building Spanish language media. And not for Spain, but rather for Latin America, though I do believe it broadcasts and is operable in Spain as well. And in a lot of the media that is produced, the titles that are used, the kind of rhetoric that you see in these articles that are put out by RT en Español or Sputnik Mundo, they tend to build on some of these residual anti-American sentiments that are left over from the Cold War era, from the era when the United States was far more politically activist in Latin America. It's interesting to me that RT, that the Kremlin and its media operations, they've actually put a lot more time and effort into their Spanish language activities than into most other services. They've explicitly said that English, Arabic, and Spanish are their most important languages, and a Spanish language television station started long before RT French began broadcasting. So it's clear that here that where they could have chosen to target Africa with a Francophone station, they instead chose to target Latin America. Why? I think because they do know that there is fertile ground for exploiting and rebuilding some of these anti-American sentiments that did remain, that still exist. I think there's also some concern that the United States may, in a way, be winning in Latin America. And by winning, I mean that in the past couple of years, you've seen the kind of Bolivarian-style, communist-inspired government that the USSR worked with so well during the 60s, 70s, 80s, and even into the 90s. You've seen those governments really kind of fall away. The last really strong one of those, Venezuela, seems to be on the brink of collapse, and in its place you have these more American-style and seemingly increasingly stable democracies emerging that seem to have more in common with the United States, which I think is something that the Russians perhaps don't want to actively forestall, but are certainly raising the public alarm. I found a quote here from Sergei Ryabkov, saying that, who's from the Russian Foreign Ministry, saying that we see attempts by the United States to interfere directly into the internal affairs of some countries in the region. Argentina, Brazil, Venezuela are just the most recent examples. So there is still a sort of concerted effort to make some of these democratic transitions seem as though they are U.S. orchestrated rather than the will of the people.
A fascinating topic, I think. Vladimir?
Yes, I'll try actually to resume a little bit to make just to generalize a little bit of what was said by Benjamin and Hannah. I think Russia and China definitely observe what each one of them is doing in Latin America. And I found the evidences of that it is happening in some of the interview with some of the officials, but also with some people in Latin American countries who are talking about this. And let me a little bit disagree with you, Hannah, when you talk about the Russian interest to develop trade and the commerce and to see actually kind of a strengthening of connections of Russia with Latin America. Because I think, yes, in the second part of the 1990s, many of Russian companies actually rushed into Latin America because they thought it's kind of a new opportunity for them. They were trying actually to build their presence. They were trying to do business with Latin America. But then when we see China appears with great interest, and in many areas, the same areas that Russians were paying interest, I think Russians soon realize that it would be very difficult for them to actually to compete with Chinese companies, which were able to always make better deals. And then when Russia started to change its strategy, and when they started, build on that perceptions of Russia as the former power which found the way to restore its presence in Latin America. So I think still there is a kind of, it's not a cooperation by any, they still kind of independently, and I think Latin America perceived by both Moscow and Beijing as kind of a neutral ground when they can test many different things. But they kind of learn from the best practices of each other. And if, for example, Russia today, which has been an extraordinary success story in Latin America, now China is trying to replicate the steps, and I know that they have approached some of the authorities in Latin American countries, to try to produce, to try to introduce Spanish language broadcasting, but made in China.
Thank you so much, Vladimir. I think that many wonderful issues emerge in these conversations. Of course, both of our first panelists stress the issue that each country in Latin America is different, and even changing government may process Cold War legacies, for example, in a different way. And also Benjamin stressed the fact that if you don't have that many ties with China, or even if you have a deficit in the bilateral trade, for example, Mexico, this probably will be a cause of concern and probably a bad image for this country in certain cases. And the issue of the Cold War legacy as an important factor, but probably a bad predictor, or something that need to be think thoroughly and not kind of automatic. I think it's wonderful. We have to remember also that Latin American countries are not just courted, but they have their own agenda, their own foreign policy, and sometimes they try to play the countries against, right? There was a recent case in Argentina in which the Russians will build and finance a nuclear plant, and the new government of Macri asked for a reduction of the interest, and Putin accepted. Macri asked for a second reduction. Putin reject Argentine request, and then automatically the Argentines went to Beijing. And so the Latin American countries are also the actors, not just courted. This is a quite important thing. Okay, we're going to have the last few minutes of this first part of the conference, of course, addressing something that was mentioned at the beginning, the relevance of the actions of China and Russia for the United States, which is, of course, a topic that many of you are really very interested in, and it's of interest of this city. And, of course, we are in a transition. Tomorrow, there will be a new president in the United States. So,
Friday.
sorry, in 48 hours, we're going to have a new president. But we are in the middle of this transition. We have been for a number of weeks. So to try to assess U.S. national interest in this issue, I think is very important, and how this national interest is perceived, or and if there will be different interpretation of this national interest. So this is basically a quite open question. As I mentioned, to have Russia and China engagement in Latin America matter, and in which way it matters to the United States.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that is, of course, a very exciting question. I would somehow, my instinct is generally, it's a belief. It's a question of what you believe, really, what you care to believe. And if you look at what is published on China, Latin America, and there are very divergent views in the both in Washington and across what scholars and think tanks bring out. I would tend to say that what China does in United States does not in any way, what China does in Latin America does not in any way threaten what the United States interests. And in some ways it doesn't maybe terribly matter. It is an opportunity. And it is perhaps what Afshin Molavi, another fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute, calls simply the rise of the 85%, which is Latin America, Asia, Africa, which is the rise of those who have the majority of the global population of the countries of the world. And in that sense, it's something we observe. And of course, the United States, as a leader in the region and in the world, is concerned. and I'm maybe a little risque comparison with the sort of jealous, possessive husband who, you know, is worried about what the wife is up to, but often this is driven by what the husband himself is sort of thinking or up to. So you know, and I looked at a number of a very interesting book by Nicholas Kralev, America's Other Army, which proves really how well prepared the United States diplomatic corps is the world over, and how it can solve, you know, a great deal influence very strongly in its own interests. And the Chinese really do not. They have a pretty solid circulation of their diplomatic staff, as I said earlier, and so they have fairly good knowledge now. And yes, it is sort of a testing ground. So they're learning. Recently, the CEO of one of the big four oil companies, the Chinese oil companies, went from Venezuela, heading Venezuela office to Peru. So of course, the sort of learning on the job, but there's no really comparison to what the United States diplomats have been able or are able to do at this time, also in questions of possible emergencies. And recently, Harold Trincunas at Brookings, who was at Brookings, published a paper and came to the same conclusion, that really the Chinese are not at this point in a position to significantly influence political interests or anything happening in Latin America, and therefore are not in that sense either a threat or and if we believe what the policy paper says, for example, that I mentioned earlier, the Chinese policy paper from November, and they even invite implicitly third parties, meaning United States and Europe and others and Russia, as well, to basically join forces and to learn from each other and to cooperate. So that obviously sounds all very joyful, but that's possible. The thing that is perhaps moving, and we can leave that for later to talk about, but where there is some movement now suddenly is the Taiwan issue. China does, of course, has been observed a truce of some sort for several years, that there have been no changes in recognition, diplomatic recognition, but of Taiwan and China. But a third of the countries that still recognize, a third of Latin American countries still recognize Taiwan. So it's quite an interesting issue that now apparently Taiwan is building up a stronger presence, strengthening its diplomatic staff in the countries where it is represented. So there may be, going forward, some change in that. And then, of course, that's when U.S. interests are somehow affected in some way.
Thank you so much, Benjamin. Hannah?
Yeah, so I wanted to very quickly actually go back to the last question that I neglected on the last round about how Russia and China see each other. And I think the best way that relationship can be characterized is by the terrifically millennial word frenemies. There's a kind of feeling that right now Russia and China have a lot in common. They're both interested in making sure that the United States does not completely control the way that the world is run and ordered. But I think, at least from the Russian side, there is a concern that, and a fear, frankly, from the Russian side, that China is going to be the new big power and that they're going to be overcome or subsumed by China. So in Latin America, I think the Russians at least tend to look at their Chinese counterparts with a bit of a wary eye, keeping an eye on the things that the Chinese are doing and making sure that they keep them in their sights and are prepared. So I just wanted to make sure that I put that answer out there. When it comes to the United States, I think a lot of the things that we've mentioned so far are why it matters to the United States. It matters to the United States because the kind of Russian propaganda that's being put out there is very often put in through a lens of anti-Americanism. It builds on that old anti-American sentiment that was once there. I think, Gonzalo, you made a very important point that we shouldn't forget the agency of all of these individual countries. We're not just talking about, we shouldn't talk of or speak of all of them as one single block, but they do all have their own agency. And you do see that, Peru, for instance, I believe, has anti-drug trafficking centers that are run both by the Russians and one by the Americans. And they choose to sort of balance each other, one off of the other. And, I think the United States is and should remain concerned that they don't completely lose all of our influence because, the Russians have convinced, name a country that our anti-drug trafficking center is better than the American anti-drug trafficking center. And you do see those kinds of efforts being, going on. One coming in and saying, well, my helicopter is better than the Chinese helicopter. There's lots of wars about helicopters and who should buy whose helicopters in Latin America. But you do see a lot of this push and pull. And I think for me, it's very interesting to sort of watch Latin America as a kind of practice ground or proving ground for great power clashes in a very small kind of way. We're not talking future wars, but it's very interesting to watch these three powers interact and see what the reaction is of the Peruvians or the Nicaraguans or the Chileans.
Thank you so much, Hannah. Vladimir?
I think the answer to this question depends greatly from the answer to the other question, to what extent Latin America will continue matters to the United States. And I think the future of relations between Russia and Latin America and China Latin America will also be impacted if there will be any changes when it comes to the attitude of the United States towards Latin America. As I was saying previously, for me, there is no doubt that the key value of Latin America for Russia is geographical proximity to the United States. And again, it matters not only in military terms, not in the kind of the game of reciprocity, but it's also very important for Russian domestic audience. And if there will be no good use of Latin America from that perspective, I think the Russian interest or the Russian incidence in Latin America might be somewhat different from what it is today. But please do not forget that both Russia and China have managed to reestablish, in the case of a relationship with almost all Latin American countries. Well, we know the Taiwan issue that Benjamin was mentioning. There is a very significant number of Latin American countries. They still recognize Taipei and not Beijing as the legitimate government of China, but it doesn't mean that there is no mainland Chinese presence in those countries. I mean, that, as you were saying, Benjamin, it's kind of a status quo, and I think there is little interest, at least for now, to go anywhere from this perspective, this kind of a perception I have from visiting the area and talking to the people there. But in the case of Russia, Russia not only managed to rebuild its old friendship, Soviet time friendship, but also establish relationship with all Latin American countries. Russian citizens can travel freely almost everywhere without a visa in Latin America. RT, and let me talk again about RT because I consider it's really important, and we all have to pay attention to a success story that RT been in Latin America, because it is true that RT program, and at least initially in Latin America, was focused on the issue that concern for the United States, and they were actually attacking the West from the same perspective as the West is attacking Russia. They were talking about and still talking about human rights violations, but by the United States. They were talking about corruption, but in the United States, RT did a huge report on the corruption related to the U.S. president in Afghanistan. But I think it's also important that RT is more and more trying to present Russia as an alternative model to liberal democracy that actually been quite successful. So you can see some programs on RT that are showing how democracy works in Russia, and you see that there are more and more programs doing that. They also, from what I understand, and I've been watching that programs often because it's available freely online, which is also one of the advantages of RT. And many young people prefer to watch RT online. So they started to produce more and more programs that are focused particularly on Latin America. For example, in Colombia, they did a report on the FARC. They did a report on a riot in a prison in Medellin, and from what you can see, the statistics, how many people watch it in Latin America, that's really an impressive number. And when we talk about China, again, I think China is watching closely what Russia is doing there. And both countries are aiming at diversifying the agenda, diversifying the ways of their engagement with Latin America. Again, if we talk about trade, of course, for Russia, trade is important, but and possibilities of arms sale is extremely important. Vladimir Putin talks again and again about the importance of Russia remain among the best sellers of the arms, talking about everything is best in Russia, of course, we know, and arms are best as well. And again, I think the biggest commercial turnover between Russia and Latin American countries, between Russia and Brazil, and still it's below 1% of the total international trade of Russia. So trade, perhaps it would be a dream for Russia, but it's still, I think it's not going well. At least it has not been a success story as in the case of China and Latin America. So I think the future is to diversify agenda, and both countries are actually committed to remain in Latin America for the future.
Thank you very much, Vladimir. I think that the comments open, and a bunch of new questions that are really very, very important. Still, even if Russian Latin American trade, it's around 10% of the total China Latin American trade, and the United States still keeping the dominant position. I see that there might be some spots of conflict, particularly in big projects, dam, energy. And I think that if the United States is going to have a Secretary of State that is interested in energy, probably energy will be an important area to look in coming years. Before we wrap up this meeting, wonderful meeting, I would like to offer the opportunity to the members of the panel maybe to wrap up their own comments, probably maybe they react to others' presentation. Just 2 minutes each.
Thank you. Well, I think
it's a right, not an obligation. So.
Yes, no, but I would like to say something that I sort of think helps get a broader view of all this. And it's interesting, whoever's read Xi Jinping's speech in Davos yesterday will find lots of very interesting quotes. It was quite surprising, even for many observers who were there, how he touched on brought up new ideas, didn't say the sort of anticipated platitudes, but actually some very interesting comments, obviously pushed back at what's been said here. But he didn't mention Latin America particularly, but he did bring up quite a number of interesting quotes, and what I basically wanted to found underscored in his approach was something that helps us also sort of relate or tie up some of these strings, is that China seems to understand the global system a bit like the human body. In fact, I was just explaining to my young daughter the other day how the human body works, and I was trying my best, from skeletons and muscles and the heart and all that. And in a way, if you understand the global system like that, then you don't try to sort of cut off certain areas. You try to promote health, economic health, growth, collaboration, coordination, and so on between all parts. And that's something I find that rings true again and again in what the Chinese government presents. And I find that a useful sort of image to metaphor to understand better how the Chinese view their interests in Latin America and in the rest of the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think the trade question is a very interesting one to me, because the Russian government, you'll hear them talk quite often about how important trade is, but the reality is that Russia does not produce much that is of interest for people to buy. Weapons, yes. Oil and gas, yes. Some minerals, yes. But Russian manufacturing is not what it used to be. It's certainly not what it could be, and it doesn't have as much to sell Latin America as I think it wishes it did. The potential is certainly there, the desire is there, but the connections are just not ready yet to be made, though you always see this desire from the Russians. It's just not ready yet. And I think the interesting thing about Russian-Chinese interaction is that both the sides seem to be good at what the other is not. Russia's much better at the cultural media side of things, where China seems to have much more of a lockdown on business and trade. And the thing that perhaps concerns me a little bit is that in large part because Russia tends to see issues of foreign policy often as a zero-sum game, that if and when China begins to move into that more cultural sphere, or if Russia begins to move better into that economic trade sphere, that you could end up with some clashes simply because of that Russian tendency to see things as a zero-sum game.
Thank you. Vladimir?
Yes, I simply would like to add to what was said by Benjamin and Hannah, that I think it's time to look from comparative perspective on what China and Russia are doing in Latin America. And there are several reasons for that from my perspective. I think we all will agree, at least in this panel, that there is no any other country from outside of the Western Hemisphere, but just China and Russia who really reemerge as the most significant new players in Latin America. Of course, we have interest of some other countries from Asia, but none of those countries, I think, came closer to the level of interactions that China and Russia have now with Latin America. And I think in the future, none of those countries are prepared to actually to lower the level of what they have achieved in their relations. There is something which actually common for both countries, that the fact that differently to what was happening during the Cold War, China and Russia have established contacts with every Latin American country and in the Caribbean. Russians, as I was already mentioning, can travel freely in Latin America, and their number is quite insignificant so far, especially in South America. But for example, in the Caribbean, you see more and more Russian traveling there. I mean, Russian is widely spoken in some places in the Caribbean. And China, of course, Chinese are also there. So this create kind of interesting new scenarios when Latin Americans, who have kind of a very uncertain image, I think, of both China and Russia, which helps both countries, because if you see those polls that are unfortunately not so frequent in Latin America, but we just conducted one of those polls in Colombia with some of my colleagues, and also in Mexico and Chile, and so you can see actually the level of approval of China and Russia always above 50%. So this is a kind of a very convenient environment for both Russia and China, but also for Latin American governments, to take advantage of this kind of relations. For political use, for getting investments. Many Latin Americans are convinced that China is the answer to many problems they have in their development programs. And Russia is a new center of power, which is actually important for Latin America because of that. So they are trying to build, or at least to maintain, a stable relation with Russia, and one of the clearest evidences that despite of the efforts, if there were efforts, but I've heard something else to try to somehow involve Latin American country in that the policy of to try to isolate Russia on the international arena as the punishment for what Russia did in Ukraine. So not a single Latin American country actually supported the United States in that efforts to isolate Russia. And Russian leaders continue to visit Latin America. And even in Colombia, the Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Lavrov, was able to make a visit and actually meeting President Santos and the Minister of Foreign Affairs. So I think so far it's been quite a success on both parts.
Well, this has been a wonderful presentation, and I really learned a lot. I like it very much, the idea of doing this comparison of Russian relations with Latin America and China relations with Latin America. We usually in this town, we naturally tend to compare China relations with Latin America with U.S. relations with Latin America, and eventually Russian relations with Latin America with U.S. relations with Latin America. So to do this exercise, I think it's quite useful. You know, the second part in the 20th century, the relationships were in Latin America, external relationships were to some extent, they have a gravity center with the United States, so they were to some extent interfered or mediated. But now the new possibilities, this new agency of Latin American countries really allow them to make their own decisions and to occupy a relevant position in the world. Other issue that I think that emerged in this morning that is really very important is still the value of geopolitics and the position in the world, right? What the United States is doing or may do in the neighborhood of China or in the neighborhood of Russia may entice a reaction and also actions in this proximity that Latin America have with the United States. This seems to be a factor that, of course, from time to time, it gets stronger and sometimes it's weaker, but it's always there. And I think that this is an issue in which we have to reflect more. Okay, we're going to start with the questions. And, well, let's start here on my right. Please, Director Armstrong.
Thanks so much. Is that better? Yeah, great. Gonzalo, thanks to all of you. Thanks to Vladimir for pulling this together, together with our colleagues from Canon. My main concern with the comparative focus, which I agree is novel, is that it leads to a sort of false equivalence between Russia and China. China is a vastly more important actor in Latin America than Russia is or can even ever aspire to be, given the dimensions of the economic relationship. I mean, you're talking about a country that loans billions of dollars in financing, that is the #1 trading partner of several important countries, including, you know, Peru and Chile, the #2 partner for countries like Argentina. Russia is, I'm not going to say insignificant, but given the preponderance of the economic relationship, it seems that Russia is in a completely different playing field, if you will. Vlad, I would actually take exception with the sense that Russian television is a major I have no question that there is an aspiration there to, you know, infiltrate, if you want to use that word, the media market in the region. But, you know, I travel a fair amount, and I know that RT is available on cable, but the statistics of who watches RT versus who watches CNN Spanish or all of the incredibly, you know, top-notch, you know, cable channels that are domestic and even, you know, region-wide, I simply question. And again, there's no doubt that Russia has a motive and an interest in playing this greater role, in competing ideologically. And then in terms of the agency of Latin American countries, there is also no question that the world and that China has offered to Latin American countries this enormous alternative option for insertion. There is a discourse, particularly in South America, of the West being in decline and the East rising, that China will become the dominant global power. Russia doesn't figure in that discourse. If you think about the countries with which it has relations, Venezuela on the brink of collapse, Nicaragua, certainly in regional terms, an insignificant and autocratic player, which, it makes sense that there would be this ideological affinity. Cuba, the same way. So as much as I welcome, trying to discuss both countries in the same breath, I think we shouldn't confuse the importance to Latin America of China as opposed to Russia.
We're going to collect 2 more questions, and then we turn around for answering. Yes, you, sir. Second row.
Hi, Rafael Bernal from The Hill. I'd like you to focus on Mexico a little bit. Benjamin, you mentioned that China doesn't really present a threat to the United States' interests in the region. There's a lot of talk of a Mexican pivot to China. Can the Mexicans, do they have it in their grasp to make it seem like there's a threat in certain negotiations that are upcoming? And on the Russian side, is the proximity of Trump and Putin sort of an obstacle to that Russian cultural interference in Mexico?
Yes, in the back.
Hi, Alex Sanchez. I write for Jane's Defense Weekly. One question on Nicaragua. Just a couple of days ago, President Ortega had his re-inauguration ceremony, the 4th or 5th at this point, and the Russian Minister of Internal Affairs, Vladimir, and cannot pronounce his last name, Kolokotsev, apologize if I mispronounced it, was in attendance, and that's a pretty big deal. So what do you think about the future of Russia-Nicaragua relations? Is Nicaragua the closest ally that Russia has nowadays in Latin America, especially in Central America, now that Venezuela is collapsing? Thank you.
Okay. We can follow the same order.
Okay. Well, thank you for all those questions. I mean, I would actually agree with Dr. Arnson in some way on how it's difficult to compare two very different influences or two different presences. On the other hand, if we look at their role in the global game and their relations with the United States, obviously Russia and China do have, a sort of similar, or comparable, I don't know whether the word is antagonism or there are certain comparable weight, and therefore one could extend that to Latin America. And the other interesting thing is to what extent there have been some studies by some colleagues of ours on how far both Russia and China managed to get UN and other international Latin American votes, support from Latin American countries in certain decision-making processes on global issues. So there is clearly beyond if we sort of leave aside a little bit the economic weight that China clearly does have, when there are political issues like that on an international fora, there one can possibly see some, or there's some weight or some value in comparing the two. It's just an idea. I mean, it is difficult always to compare. When it comes to Mexico, clearly Mexico is not the only country to play the China card, to put it that way. Colombia tried that. There was people interpreted the fact that President Santos offered China the possibility of building a dry canal across the north of Colombia, but basically in a push to bring to the attention of the United States that they really wanted the FTA. It was sort of like, we can also go with China, but there was no serious consideration. I don't know how serious the Chinese took it at the time. So I think there are obviously a couple of countries who might play the China card in a way, yes, to pressure, to help to negotiate, to pursue certain interests. And the same goes for Nicaragua. And there are several, simply, let's face it, just very small countries who sometimes become very important because they also have votes in international institutions, and they want to, negotiate things in the interests of their pursue own policies, and so they will draw in and draw attention to themselves with by becoming much closer to some of the for example, to Russia and China, to big players on the global arena. I think that's really what is happening to some extent. Costa Rica was another great example that played it very, very well. That is a fantastic example of collaboration between China and Costa Rica. And you could say, well, it's a small country, what does it matter? But it does, and especially to itself. But there are, therefore, it can suddenly become take on important roles in many in the international arena through its associations.
Thank you. Hannah?
Yeah, I'll try and be quick on these. On Russia Today or RT in Espanol in Latin America, I do think it's been reasonably successful. There is the case, actually several cases where RT is not only on cable or just in hotel rooms, but in Argentina, for instance, it's on broadcast. I think the same is true in Venezuela, Nicaragua. And they also have a kind of sharing or cooperation agreement with Telesur in order to co-produce some of the same material from RT Espanol, and they tend to have kind of sharing agreements to make sure that they learn the same lessons from each other. I've seen some of the statistics on how high viewership is for RT, and it's certainly far higher than it is in the United States. It drastically varies by country. Drastically. In some places, it's only really available by satellite. In others, it's right there on your broadcast television. But Russia's clearly making a concerted effort, one that I'm not sure that, at least just looking at the past attempts of China with CCTV, Russia seems to be much better at that kind of mass media outreach than the Chinese do, but perhaps the Chinese are going to learn some of the same lessons just by watching RT. So I think that's actually a very interesting place to watch. Online, they've actually also been extremely successful. If you look, the RT has a sort of strategy of putting in political videos and mixing them with, I don't know, a dash cam video of meteorites hitting a cow or something like that. And so they're able to sort of put in these amusing videos that are the thing that draws the viewers because it's posted on Facebook or Instagram or some kind of fun media tool or social media tool. And then the next available video, the one that pops up and plays immediately afterwards, is a political video that people then in turn go on to watch. So I don't think RT is not just a television station, but it works in several other ways. I think on the Mexico, Trump and Putin question, it's frankly too far. It's too early to tell. We still don't know who's going to be running Russia policy, really. Perhaps it'll be Mr. Trump himself, but I really think it's far too early to say even how the Trump-Putin relationship is going to develop. We're just going to have to wait and see. There's a lot of guessing going on, but anybody who tells you that they actually know is probably lying. On Nicaragua, Russia, yeah, I think it's quite significant that Mr. Kolokoltsev was there at the inauguration. It's, will be interesting to see the extent to which Russia sort of transfers its loyalties and friendship from Venezuela to Nicaragua. Russia seems to have been very reticent in the past several months as Venezuela sort of slowly falls apart. They're increasingly reticent to give more loans and to keep supporting a regime that seems incapable of bringing itself back from the brink. But that Nicaragua relationship has gone on for quite some time, and you often have visits of Russian officials to Nicaragua, so I don't think it's anything too terribly strange, but certainly something to keep an eye on.
Thank you, Hannah. Vladimir?
Well, thank you for the questions. Let me address first Sydney question about the possibility or actually if it's worth or not comparing Russia and China and Latin America. I think it is because, first of all, both China and Russia are among those players on the global scale that are really important if we talk about what was happening during these 25 years after the end of the Cold War. And I think this importance is, many Latin American leaders are well aware of this importance of Russia. And both China and Russia are actually look at the ways of their involvement with Latin America taking into account the global objectives, the foreign policy global objectives. And I think this is actually why we may try to learn some lessons of how those countries actually design in their strategy and how they implement their strategies in this new post-Cold War context. And of course, China and Russia are permanent members of the Security Council, and they interact in many other international organizations. Both China and Russia have observer status with the Organization of the American States, and I'm not going to discuss actually what the Organization of American States represent these days. But then again, I think this is something that actually can be considered from comparative perspective. When it comes to RT, that was already mentioned, I think I agree with you that RT so far, and it's very far from that perspective to replace CNN in Espanol or replace some other media that has been in Latin America for a long time. But I think it also actually important to take into consideration that the audience of RT is growing. I mean, RT just started a few years ago, maybe five years ago, with the Spanish language broadcasting. The first of their programs was just, translating the program they made in English. They had difficulties with the language. Many of the reporters were actually Russians speaking Spanish. So they had some difficulties, but they learned quickly that there is a certain gap in Latin America, and I think you are one of the greatest specialists in Latin America, I know, and that there is a certain deficit in Latin American countries when it comes to the sources of information Latin Americans are getting outside of Latin America, the international news. So I think RT, what it's trying to do is to fill that gap, and they're doing a lot of things on the internet. RT is available 24/7, freely, high quality. The way how they do their programs is actually very, very interesting and important. It's attractive for many young Latin Americans, and I think they're not going to give up it. And so they are doing something that they consider that actually is working. And if we talk about Russia and Nicaragua, Russia, when Russia started the process of re-engagement with Latin America in the second part of 1990s, actually Russia was trying to see what kind of relations can be built with different Latin American countries. But I think it's not a coincidence that the Russian rapprochement actually was taking place at the same time as the left turn in Latin America, and there's a number of reasons for that. And in the case of Nicaragua, I think for Daniel Ortega, with his past in the rebel struggle, actually Russia, modern Russia, should be called Soviets. I mean, for him, Soviets are back, not Russians are back. And so I think there is a great deal of trust, personal trust, between Daniel Ortega and Vladimir Putin. Daniel Ortega was the first one who came to rescue Vladimir Putin after the war in Georgia in 2008. Nobody wanted to support Vladimir Putin. It was Daniel Ortega who was the first country who told, I'm going to recognize the independence of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. I'm going to open embassies there. So I think in terms of Nicaragua, Russia considered that it is affordable, the aid, and they're receiving some aid from Russia. It's actually kind of relations that Russia is eager to maintain, and I think this is one of the focal points would be for Russia in Central America. And when it comes to Mexico, again, I would agree with Hannah. It would be very difficult to speculate now what might happen. I think we're all waiting to some more certainty in terms of what the policy will be. But again, as I was saying, Russia has stable relation with all Latin American countries. I think they believe they have the means to advance whatever the objective of their foreign policy would be in this new context during the administration of Mr. Trump.
Well, excellent questions, and I have many things to keep busy in coming days thinking about thoroughly. I just want to add a very short comment on Director Art's question. I agree 100% with Cynthia that clearly we cannot support the position that both countries are engaging with Latin America with the same intensity, particularly if we think in quantitative terms, and particularly if we think in economic terms. Clearly, there is a disproportion. I mentioned previously that roughly Russian trade with Latin America, it's about 10% of China-Latin America trade. However, I still find the exercise really very useful because some people may have the idea, before thinking thoroughly about this, that both countries may have an impact of similar size. And I think that the exercise of comparing let us know with more precision the difference in the style of engagement and the possibilities and how you have to react to each of them. I think that you gain a lot of precision in knowing that there are different styles and different kind of intensity. I think it's quite useful also not only to give a quantitative perspective, but also qualitative perspective. I think that it helps for policymakers or for other people to have a better understanding of the similarities and difference between both. You want to add on this?
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly add on one sort of comment on that, which is I find that it is quite fascinating to look at these because when I read articles published recently, often still China and Russia are viewed as somewhat destabilizing or as questioning global norms, so-called global norms. And now we have exactly the opposite, that suddenly the stable ones in Latin America could be Russia and China. And clearly, I mean, any message that almost President Trump has sent out is destabilizing, often on purpose, of course, that's a strategy, and partly unintentionally. And that's why I find those are very interesting ones to, many people will sort of think, well, we don't know what is going to come next, we'll go with China, or Russia for that matter. That there are certain messages, the way messages are sent out, that they have proven, Russia and China have proven to be somewhat more predictable than what we have now.
Yeah, we have the same problem in other areas. For example, when we think about the BRICS, for example, there can be no more different countries as the members of the BRICS, and still we talk about them. We cannot skip this. I will collect another 3 questions, another round of questions. Yes, the lady there.
Can you hear me? Good.
Yes, perfect.
Okay, I'm Gretchen Small with Executive Intelligence Review by Lyndon LaRouche's magazine, and I have a feeling that this discussion is very much in what I would call the old paradigm, and without elaborating, there is a new paradigm being pulled together with countries across the world. With something that hasn't been named here, but does have an impact on Latin America itself, which is centered around the One Belt, One Road, or the Belt and Road Initiative of China, of connecting what my magazine has proposed should be all the continents through the Bering Straits, down the Darien Gap, down into South America. And it is a project which you have to be very clear from a higher level. Russia and China are very coordinating on this. So in and they have both made offers, which I think should be taken seriously, to the United States, as well as to the region of Latin America. Let us cooperate in a different, non-unipolar world in which we're defined on what Xi said yesterday, what was very interesting, a policy where development is of the people, by the people, and for the people, something we Americans know very closely, something the Chinese know through Sun Yat-sen. Interesting that Xi would put it that way. In the Latin American context, I'm not going to speak forever, The specific thing that I think is most interesting is the Chinese proposal for the Transcontinental South American Railroad, which would be a game changer for development of the whole region. It's a long-standing desire. It would open up the interior of the continent, and I don't understand why the United States has to constantly continue to be viewing these kind of things as an attack on us rather than an opportunity, which we should jump in, and I think that would change our relationships with these countries dramatically.
Thank you. Another question. Yes, right in back.
Thank you. My name is Hong Zhang. I'm a PhD student from George Mason University. My question is about the perception of the Chinese model of political economy in Latin America, given the important economic role related to the previous question. Like China is proposing a lot of very major infrastructure projects in Latin America, and China is building and financing many of these projects, especially in countries like Ecuador or some other countries. So is there interest or are there discussions in these countries about the attractiveness of the Chinese model of, we can say, state capitalism, state-led development? Is there a reorientation of development strategy or economic policies in these countries towards the Chinese model? Thank you.
Thank you. Sir?
I'm Dr. Sam Hancock of Emerald Planet TV, and I want to change the discussion almost totally, going to the environment, because this may be one way to provide collaboration, cooperation between China, not so much Russia maybe, and the United States, but across Latin America, because most of those countries, I think maybe all of them, have signed on to the COP21 and are collaborating as far as how we're going to address severe climate change, and how do we improve in most of the major cities of Latin America the climates within each of those different areas. So I think we can expand this conversation beyond just the normal topics.
Thank you.
Well, we can expand it in many directions. That's no question that this is just sort of touching the surface. Very true. On environmental issues, there would be a lot of possibilities for collaboration. Again, what it boils down to is, of course, how well are contacts made at a local level? I mean, many in Latin America, you just mentioned environment in China, and people say, well, look at all their polluted cities, and forget that they're producing more solar panels than anyone else. So there are many possibilities of collaboration. Then instead it focuses, for example, on collaboration, and they get dams built, which have now been found, of course, to be very significant emitters of methane, and that they're in themselves also a huge problem. So it's quite tricky. What would be useful, I refer to what I touched on earlier, when the global norms and the Chinese norms. Will the Chinese change or join the global norms? And it turns out that actually in many fields, in environment, in mining and so on, Chinese norms are actually superior to certainly what Canadians are doing and what Australians and so on. So, and there have been studies on this. So it's quite interesting that what has to be overcome is opinion and perception and prejudice. And so there are possibilities, without a doubt. And the same goes for Obor. I mean, you're right, but I did mention the rise of the 85%. So in that sense, there is, of course, a possibility, or that there's a paradigm shift that in that sense of Latin American finding possibilities to respond, to develop the infrastructure in the countries and regionally with Chinese help. So yeah, I think that there are definitely possibilities, and yes, it would be welcome. There are ideas that perhaps the rebuilding of United States infrastructure would also benefit from Chinese activity, but we will see. But about paradigm shifts, the lady at the back who asked about state capitalism, I think there, the China model is not really replicable. I mean, it's a pretty unique place without insisting on being exceptional. It is simply different from any country in Latin America, especially. So I don't think there has been, if anything, it's a certain skepticism, and still there is not that there was some sort of satirical comments a few years ago. Why do Latin American politicians are so eager to go to China? Is it because they want to learn how to maintain themselves, in power or single-party system? But those are not serious. Don't seem to be serious searches, desires of. There's not real modeling in Latin America on China, I don't think.
I'm going to defer to Vladimir since all these are on China.
Okay. Starting with the question about what are the perceptions in Latin America about China as an alternative model. I did a research, and a few years ago I looked at the discussion in the print media in Latin America, and it's easy to see that, in fact, there has been interest, rather constant interest to how China organized and what are the institutions, what are the ideas of development, and especially in those countries where there is a more clear political divisions like Venezuela, it was easy to see that those newspapers, those columns of opinion that were written by the people belonging to the left of the political spectrum that would actually support greatly the Chinese ideas, the Chinese political institutions, and from the other side of the political spectrum that would greatly criticize it. But it's something that actually is happening, I think, in Latin America. If we look, there are some questions, there are some interest to China, and from to much lesser extent to Russia. I think this has been, it would be difficult for me to talk if there has been any discussions, even though RT again is trying to promote the idea that the way how the politics are done in Russia is something that really is working and is for the people. And in terms of environment, again, I think many, and Benjamin, you may correct me, but I think many people in Latin America are well aware about the environment issues in China.
Exactly.
And this is
But as a negative.
Yes, from a negative perspective. So I remember a couple of years ago, or maybe even last year, there was an offer from the Chinese government for several regional government officials from Colombia to make some trips to China just to see how they're dealing with them. And I remember with the environment issues. And when they were back and they made a report on that, they were actually thinking, we're doing much better than China. So I think it's one of the questions that can be linked to the discussion about China's incidents in Latin America, but I think it's still kind of a issue that maybe China is having difficulties to promote. And talking about this new paradigm, I think let me go now to China and Russia. I would support what Hannah was saying, that for Russia, Latin America to a certain extent is a kind of a testing ground, that Russia may try to attempt to do something there because Russia is considering that it's convenient, that it's affordable, especially now when the cost of doing something in different parts of the world would be a kind of high. And it may be not so in the case of China, but I think the future scenarios are quite interesting. And again, I would insist that we see the kind of diversification of the agenda of both China and Russia dealing with Latin America. And I think in the future we will see more kind of cases and more kind of topics to talk about.
Just a very brief comment on the issue of environment. I think that after this 15 years or so of intense engagement of China with certain Latin American countries, we need to do more research and to have a more clear understanding of the impact in the environment that this intense exchange has produced. In my view, it's quite important. Most of it, it's quite locally relevant, but there might be other issues emerging. There have been protests of native population in some areas, in Peru, in Ecuador, in other countries that have received the impact of mining activities. So I think that it's now the time to prepare this balance, the environmental balance of this last 15 years of interaction. I think that this is an area that we need to do a lot of work in coming years. Okay. Questions? Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Bob Eichert from the Atlantic Council, formerly of the State Department. Obviously, one of the legacies of Obama may be seen as the opening to Cuba. And obviously, Cuba, along with Argentina and some of the others, represent major changes in political orientation, or at least in terms of our relationships with these countries. Obviously, Russia was very much involved in Cuba for many years. What is the implications of our opening in terms of Russia and Chinese interest in Cuba? And what's your crystal ball as to what's going to happen there?
Well, you still my last question that was focused on Cuba. I really wanted to hear, a comment on Russia engagement in Cuba and China engagement in Cuba, particularly under the new circumstances developed by the Obama administration, and maybe to speculate about what may happen in coming months. I also have a last question that I received by Vincent Lofaso of Hudson Institute. One significant event you mixed this was President Xi visit to Latin America to create bilateral ties and strengthen economic ties. China and Latin America both depend each other. How can they open a new chapter for the future? I think you touched on this briefly. Maybe you want to add something.
Yeah, I mean, on that one, I felt that I tried to emphasize that it was just another step in the same direction, that China has this long-term strategy and hasn't significantly changed, trying to adjust and trying to coordinate the many activities that are going on the ground. In terms of Cuba, that is a very fascinating area. I haven't actually been there, and I'm planning to go shortly. But what I... If there is any example of the U.S. being a sort of, or the current changes and the imminent changes in U.S. Policy, even the discussion of them, even if they don't ultimately change, is destabilizing, and therefore there may be a stronger leaning again among. Surely there are many interest groups in Cuba that would still say, well, you see, we shouldn't have done it anyway. We should have stuck with our old friends. So I would say there is an interesting. Internal development where factions can be strengthened or weakened by what's going on outside. So in that, and China certainly, from what I have heard, has been concerned because was rather concerned with the opening up, with the normalization, let's say, of ties between the United States and Cuba, because it has grown some investments there and has quite a strong position there economically, but again, they were sort of quietly observing, and this could now all change and be put in question again. I don't know whether.
Thank you.
What you would add?
Anna?
Yeah, I think on the Russia-Cuba relationship, it's actually quite interesting, but it's been quite a little interesting to watch the Russian reaction to the U.S. opening up to Cuba. I think it was actually during the talks, and correct me if I'm wrong, but during the talks between Cuba and the U.S., a Russian intelligence ship showed up in the Havana harbor. And you've seen a sort of a lot of things like that, Russia saying, we're going to sell more oil to Cuba, or Russia offering cooperation via Rosatom in the area of medical and nuclear cooperation. So you've seen a lot of visits and concerns. You also had, again last year, when Patriarch of Kirill, of the Russian Orthodox leader, he actually ended up meeting with the Pope in Cuba. And so you do see that the Russians seem to be a little concerned, even talking about reopening a military base in Cuba. They're a little bit concerned that Cuba is going to slip out of their grasp and no longer be the kind of strong anti-American ally 90 miles off the coast that they once were. I think there's definitely a concern. Of course, it remains to be seen how the situation is going to develop under soon-to-be President Trump. I think that'll be very interesting to watch and to look at that dynamic between Putin, Trump, and Castro. That, I think, is going to be a sort of very fascinating behind-the-scenes little relationship to watch. But yeah, you certainly see a lot of concern from the Russians in watching this situation change after so many years of stability. I think they're not quite sure what to make of it.
Thank you, Hannah. Vladimir, to wrap up. This.
Just to add quickly to what Hannah and Benjamin was saying, focusing on Russia, as I was saying earlier today, the key value of Latin America for Russia, its geographical proximity to the United States. And Cuba, I think, no any other country represent this so clearly for Russians. But Cuba is also is a perfect match for many things that are happening inside Russia today. It's a romanticization, the term of the
Yes.
Soviet past, and Cuba is, of course, which is still known for many Russians as the island of liberty. And it's so convenient for the Russian TV to show that Russia is back and Russia is again a global player. So Cuba will remain for Russia the interest there because of that primarily. But then, of course, I agree that Russians share a great deal of concern to see what kind of relations Cuba will have with the United States for many other reasons as well.
Well, this has been a very interesting and wonderful morning. I want to thank everybody, the authorities for the organization of this event, the panelists, and thank you to all of you. Have a good day.
Thank you very much. It was great points. I agree almost all of
I was there.
Thank you so much.
Wish I could have made your points too. I'm sorry, I was reading.
It was an honor.